Hey there, welcome back to part 2. Now we're going to cover the limbic system. Okay, so the limbic system is made out of the rhinencephalon, and it's the oldest part of the cerebral cortex. It's made out of 3 parts: the allocortex, which is going to be made out of only 3 cell layers; the juxta-allocortex, or also known as the mesocortex, that's made out of 3 to 5 layers; and the neocortex. This is the most developed. It's going to be made out of 6 layers of cells. Limbic system in general fully develops at age 25. So what does it do? It plays a whole lot of roles. Reward, avoidance, emotion, memory. There's linkage to addiction, motivation, sexual activities, and the transformation of memory from short-term into long-term memory, and the association of memory with stimuli and emotion. Okay, so the cortical structures is the limbic lobe. That's going to be made out of the cingulate gyrus, the isthmus, the hippocampal gyrus, and the uncus. Hippocampal formation is going to be made out of these different parts of the hippocampus. Subcortical nuclei is going to be made out of, the most important ones you need to know are the amygdaloid complex, the olfactory neurons, the hypothalamus, the mammary bodies, and the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. Okay, so there is another lecture about the olfactory path, but in general, it's a straightforward path that goes from the olfactory nerves through the cribriform plate and to the olfactory cortex. And the olfactory cortex is made out of the piriform lobe and the entorhinal area. So why is this important and why are we mentioning it here? It's because it passes right through the limbic system and has plenty of connections there, especially in the entire entorhinal area, in the thalamus, that has a smell-mediated sexual behavior and memory. So this links your sexual arousal. So remember your first boyfriend, right? And a certain cologne that he used to wear, like Axe cologne. So it's very strong, it's very distinctive, right? So because it's a very strong and distinctive smell, and you're a horny teenager, you're aroused at that time, whenever you smell this certain smell again, it's easy to reawaken these memories because of the olfactory path going right through the limbic system. So the amygdaloid body is part of the caudate nucleus, and it has more than just a fear response. The amygdaloid body is actually quite complex. It controls the somatic responses to internal needs, drives, and instincts, and that doesn't just mean fear or adverse stimuli. So part of it has that olfactory input, so there is an association between smell and these strong emotions. So the stimulation of the amygdaloid body causes excitability or fear, rage, and damage of the amygdaloid body reduces the fear response and increases the sexual activity. So, and curiously enough, people in their late 60s, especially males, they become perverted in their sexual behavior because of the damage or the degeneration of the amygdaloid body. There is going to be a reduction of fear in consequence and an increase in the sexual activity. So these pedophiles are going to sexually assault children because they have more I hate to say it, access to the children, because they are grandparents. So when parents are working, you leave your you leave their children to be taken care of by their grandparents. So of course this is fairly rare, but something to keep in mind. The cortical medial area of the limbic system is going to be made out of this cortical nucleus and the central nucleus, which is going to be involved in sexual behavior, thanks to all of these. And the input will come from the olfactory bulb along with the visceral sensory input from the brainstem nuclei, and the output goes to the thalamus via the stria terminalis. The basolateral group is going to be receiving the optic and acoustic input and sensory information from the temporal lobe, the insula, and the association cortices. And all of this kind of connects to the entorhinal area. So here's the emotional stimuli. It goes to the auditory thalamus, especially if you're hearing like a loved one's voice. So it goes to the auditory cortex, association cortex, in order to be processed. Goes through here to be recovering the memory from the hippocampus and the entire rhinal complex, and then it kind of feeds into the lateral nucleus. So there is going to be feed forward to the basal and to the central nucleus, and then there finally you can have your response. Okay, so the septal area, made out of the septal pallidum and the septal nuclei and the paraterminal gyrus, it's going to connect the amygdaloid body with the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hippocampus, it's going to be the main part of the cortex. And, okay, so the associations. Medial to the hippocampus are the fimbriae, the dentate gyrus, the hippocampal sulcus, and the parahippocampal gyrus. So the dentate gyrus is made out of a mossy fiber system, so that's important to note. And the pyramidal and multiform layers are going to provide the output to the hippocampus. So here's the hippocampus proper. Here's the parahippocampus gyrus. Okay, so what is the hippocampus itself? The fornix is going to be the output of the hippocampus, and it's made out of the pyramidal axons, and it's going to be connected to the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the septal region. It's made out of the fimbriae, the alveus, the body, the crus, and the columns. So here is the commissure. Here is the body. Here is the crus. 75% of the fornix does synapse in the mammillary bodies and the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. The rest, however, will synapse in the septal nucleus or the septal pallidum. Okay, so what's important about the fornix? It has a role in maintaining emotional tone. So what is emotional tone, right? So this is like kind of you at baseline, whether you're a fairly happy person or a fairly sad or introspective, I should say, person. It also plays a role in kind of recovering recent memory due to holding the declarative memory. So these are episodic memory. This is memory that you know of, like words, things that you can pull. Okay, so motivation is defined as the internal signals that shape voluntary behavior. Interestingly enough, 35% of our brain are made out of rewarding centers. 5% are aversive, while 60% are just neutral. The reward is mostly made out of a dopaminergic path that goes from the ventral tegmentum to the nucleus accumbens. Nucleus accumbens is the reward center because it is the place where it produces dopamine. The frontal cortex and the hypothalamus does play a part in this system, but avoidance and punishment, more importantly, is going to be made out of the lateral portion of the posterior hypothalamus, the dorsal midbrain, and the entorhinal cortex. And this has the fear to terror emotions. Okay, so addiction. Addiction is the mesolimbic path to the nucleus accumbens. So here's the nucleus accumbens, and it's going to be due to the increased dopamine concentration in the reward area. And the amygdala, interestingly enough, has a big role in temptation. So here's the mesolimbic path. It's a pretty short path. So from the ventral tegmental area straight to the nucleus accumbens. The substantia nigra is going to make the dopamine, and the anterior cingulate is going to be focused on the source of the temptation. So amygdala is going to help you feel the temptation. The anterior cingulate is going to help you recognize what is causing the temptation. Okay, so what are your negative emotions? Fear plays a role in, or the hypothalamus and the amygdala plays a role in it, because the amygdaloid nucleus will encode the memories that evoke fear. And anxiety is going to be produced by the frontal part of the temporal lobe. And the A2 GABA receptors are going to mediate anxiety. So the benzodiazepines, anti-anxiety medication, is going to increase the chlorine conductance in those receptors. So we're going to have more GABA available to, it's going to help the receptors be more receptive to the GABA. So GABA is going to be your inhibitory neuron, right? Or neurotransmitter, right? So it's going to help you mediate the anxiety. So the cingulate gyrus is going to normally modulate the response to pain, but a lesion will cause a overreaction to the pain, and from there it can be encoded into the amygdaloid nucleus, and then now you have fear due to whatever stimulus, right? Okay, so what is rage? Rage is anger in response to minor stimuli. It can be caused by destruction of the neocortex, the ventral median hypothalamus, and the septal nuclei. Placidity is not just the opposite of rage. Placidity is the emotional stage where the person isn't disturbed, even in response to major stimuli. So this can be positive stimuli too. A bilateral lesion of the amygdaloid nucleus or removal will cause the plasticity. And the next definition is aggression. Aggression is a violent form of rage. It can be due to high testosterone, hypothalamic, and amygdala nuclei, like tumors that secrete too much testosterone, and those will like constantly stimulate these two structures. So patients who illegally take testosterone injections, so not just oral testosterone, because this is not going to work with oral testosterone, but the ones who take the juice and their testosterone is very, very high, these people do have a much shorter fuse because of it. The removal of the frontal cortex to the limbic system, so this entire like mesolimbic system, like removal of that area will cause permanent and intense aggression due to the fact that there is no longer any modulation to the rage response. Okay, so the sexual reflex is controlled by the spinal cord and the brainstem, and the sexual behavior, on the other hand, is going to be modulated by the limbic system and the higher cortical centers. So these are going to override the limbic influence and refine the behavior. So just because you find like a girl attractive doesn't mean you can just drop trow in the middle of a restaurant, especially if you're trying to woo them, right? So that's where your higher cortical center comes in, just to override the very, very base limbic influence. So in males, a lesion of the neocortex will inhibit the sexual behavior, and a bilateral lesion in the limbic system and the destruction of the amygdala will cause hypersexuality. So the lesion in the limbic system will cause, it's like a twofold kind of problem, right? There is going to be a problem in the inhibition and modulating of the sexual behavior, and this person is going to be like turned on all the time. And I don't mean just sexually aroused, but like this person is going to be constantly seeking the arousal too. On the other hand, in females, the lesion of the anterior hypothalamus is going to completely abolish sexual activity. So these people will be asexual. There is no interest or desire in any kind of, arousal. This is usually due to some kind of like compression of like pharyngioma or something, because if it's near the pituitary and compressed, there's no LH, no FSH release. So this will also have a problem in like amenorrhea. So back to the autonomic nervous system, the hypothalamus is the main ganglion of the ANS. And the insular and the prefrontal area of the cortex is going to regulate the ANS. And then the limbic system also will influence it, so that's more of the sexual drive. Okay, so damage is mostly bilateral, and it can have a whole host of symptoms, such as changes in short term memory, emotionality, fear, aggression, and rage. And this can also result in seizures, of course. The damage can be due to strokes or toxins and infections. The enterocortex and the basal forebrain, they are major sources of acetylcholine, and they are the sources of afferent input to the hippocampus. So this is prone to degeneration in Alzheimer due to the lack of acetylcholine production. So once those cells atrophy, there's no more afferent input to the hippocampus, so there's not going to be any new memories encoded. So there's going to be that dementia forming, right? And over time, there's not going to be any ability for memory recall to occur either. So damage to the amygdala is going to cause an inability to express the appropriate responses to known stimuli and learn the appropriate responses to new stimuli. So usually it's in some kind of fear. So I live in the South, right? So when we see a rattlesnake, the appropriate response to a rattlesnake is fear. We don't want to go near a rattlesnake. We do not want to touch a rattlesnake. So the amygdala is going to help us say, like, hey, don't touch it, back away, like run away. But damage to the amygdala, like, I might not remember. Like, I see a rattlesnake and I don't remember to fear because I don't have that association anymore. And then there's also the problems of learning the appropriate responses to new stimuli. So if I see like a shark now, I'm not going to feel fear because I can't learn that response. I don't feel any fear. So there's no encoding of that memory. Next is the Kluver-Bucy syndrome, and it can be caused by herpes simplex encephalitis, which will affect the temporal lobe, along with strokes, trauma, Alzheimer. Also be caused by Niemann-Pick disease, which is like a cholesterol and lipid metabolic problem. So is an inability to metabolize those like products. And all of that is going to cause cross-modal sensory association problems. It can also be a distinguishing characteristic of Urbach-Wieth disease, which is a lesion in the amygdaloid body. So what's going to happen? There's visual agnosia, so patient is not going to be able to recognize objects when they see it, like something like a cup sitting in front of me. If I have the symptoms, I'm not going to be able to recognize that is a cup. I would just know that's something in front of me, even though I have grown up knowing that, yes, what is in front of me is a cup. The other problems are an increased oral tendency. So because of the visual agnosia and the sexual characteristic of these diseases, there's going to be a tendency to investigate everything with their mouth. So this is regression to childhood behaviors. You know how kids just kind of stick everything in their mouth to try to like identify the taste and the texture of things? That's going to happen in a patient suffering from Hoover-Bucy syndrome. So because of the increased oral tendency is going to lead to the hyperphagia. So these patients are going to overeat. They are prone to obesity and hypersexuality because of the amygdaloid region being affected. Another symptom of this very interesting syndrome is the hypermetamorphosis, which is a failure to ignore the peripheral stimuli. So this patient is going to respond to every single stimuli. Think about all the things we kind of block out, right? So if you sit in a room for a long time, you don't really realize the ambient temperature or the ambient brightness until it dips below or above threshold, and then you realize like, hey, this room is uncomfortably warm, or this room is uncomfortably bright, then you kind of realize it. But that's a natural response for the body and the mind to focus on the more important things. So right now you're trying to listen to the lecture, you're trying to pay attention to what I'm saying. There doesn't need to be a hyper focus on whether the room is bright, dim, or too warm or too hot. So these patients are going to kind of present with ADHD like syndrome symptoms too. So the inability to kind of like focus. And so, like, this is a very tricky disorder or syndrome to diagnose because it has all these like different manifestations, right? So, important to do an MRI if you suspect this syndrome. They also have a decreased emotion and fear response. So the fear response is natural, but the decreased emotion, there's going to be a lack of a emotional tone. So this person is going to have a very flat affect. That's what they call it in neuroscience, right? So it's just going to be very, very monotone, but in personality. So they're not going to respond very positively to anything, but neither will they respond very negatively to anything. So that's called flat affect. Lumbic encephalitis can be caused by a whole host of carcinomas. So it's also known as a paraneoplastic syndrome. It involves the hippocampus, the amygdala, the cingulate gyrus, the insula, and the orbital frontal cortex. So because of all of those being affected, it's going to cause the subacute dementia thanks to the involvement of the hippocampus and the cingulate gyrus, the changed emotional tone thanks to the damage to the amygdala, and then the involuntary movement ataxia due to the cingulate gyrus, the insula, and the orbital frontal cortex. So there's going to be a lack of coordination occurring. However, this is not in every single cancer patient, so this is pretty rare. Corsica psychosis is due to just massive amounts of chronic alcohol abuse. It's going to cause damage to the mammillary bodies, the dorsomedial nucleus of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So there's going to be impairment of recent and remote memory due to the damage to the mammillary bodies. The recent memory is more disturbed, so in these patients, they're not going to remember anything that happened the night before, right? So that is going to be gone. But the immediate recall is preserved, so though they won't remember anything that happened last night, they can remember that, you were talking to them this morning, if you saw them in the afternoon, of course. In general, this is caused by the thiamine deficiency due to just malnutrition, because these people drink instead of eat. So as you can see here, this is the frontal cortex of somebody who has Korsakoff psychosis, and this is a fairly healthy individual. Look how much of the atrophy is occurring here. The brain has lost so much gray matter. Here's another. This is a healthy individual. This is a patient with Korsakoff psychosis. This is a person with severe drinking problems. So not only is the brain shrinkage pretty extreme, look at all the gyri and the sulcuses, they're very wide. This person also had a stroke. And so here, these dark regions are strokes, right? So study on the MRIs. This is going to come in handy as a clinician. Okay, so that's it for now. Thank you for your attention and good luck studying.